And EU on human rights has been very much referred to already. Last week we had a meeting. The members of the subcommittee are very closely following the human rights dialogue carried out by the EU with its partners, and in this case with Kazakhstan, which is one of our priorities, in particularly following the adoption of the resolution of the Parliament last February, which stresses, as we know, respect for human rights and calls upon Kazakhstan to respect human rights and to put in place international rules in this field. So today we're going to talk about developments and Kazakhstan's goals in human rights with several guests. Elvira Azimova, who's a mediator for Kazakhstan. Ms. Azimova was part of the Human Rights Dialogue on the 2nd of December and the previous session in Brussels in the summer. She'll talk about her mandate, which I imagine is no mean feat, and her priorities. Thank you very much, Ms. Azimova, for joining us. We'll also be hearing from a representative of a Kazakh NGO and an international organization, the Bureau of Human Rights and Rule of Law, based in Almaty, as well as Human Rights Watch, before giving the floor to you, my dear colleagues. So first, I will give the floor to Ms. Azimova for maximum of 10 minutes. Really, that is the maximum. Thank you.
Ms. Azimova, you have the floor. You can press the speak button now. Thank you.
Меня слышно? Все хорошо?
Can you hear me? Thank you. Chair, respected parliamentarians, I'm very happy to be able to speak to you. I've understood the timing a bit wrong, but I'll try and sort that out. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I think that my colleagues from human rights organizations will also take the floor and identify the most pressing issues giving rise to concern and the steps ahead. What I wanted to say very briefly is the following. Very recently, the government of Kazakhstan, and before the visit of the head of the state, there was the minister to the justice minister, which led to the provision of information on the state of human rights in Kazakhstan. And this practice, these regular briefings, will be now regular. And we welcome that because it's very useful to have direct information on all issues of concern. I think that before the information got to the European parliamentarians, it was made available in the group of ministers. But I think it is now available to parliamentarians, the European Parliament. So I won't go into it in detail. I think just to draw the conclusion from it that primarily we're seeing an increase in interparliamentary dialogue between the European Parliament and the Kazakhstan Parliament. Another thing that's important is having feedback from the European Parliament in both directions and trying to understand what commitments entail. And this enables an improvement in the dialogue not only at the government level, but also at the lawmaking level. We understand that decisions affecting the whole system take place at the level of the legislator, the parliamentarians. We understand there are individual cases. It's important to make sure that they're not repeated and that they don't become systematic. So in that respect, it's very important to involve the legislature. It's very important not to forget the report made by the General Secretary of the UN, Secretary General rather, on the cooperation of the UN with national parliaments and interparliamentary unions. And that was in March last year. What that report said, and this is very important, was relevant to the context of the pandemic, and obviously that had a huge impact on social and political life. But also there is identified a lack of consensus on how best to manage digital technologies, migration, public health, etc. This is a situation we're very much aware of in Kazakhstan. There are many issues facing us, and the work of the government is continuing in this area. Now, obviously, I can't say it's completed. What I can say is that we've had significant quality results. There are many discussions still underway, but what's important to remember is that the government is taking these issues on, and we're getting expert advice on how to move forward in these areas. It's very important to have specialist input. These are not simple questions, they're multifaceted, and it's not easy to just say they're good or bad. We need to get very much involved in the process and fully understand them. So we very much welcome a clear specialist position with the support and the follow-up, which is then something that can take place in public, transparently. It's very important that the public are aware of what's going on. We want to be as transparent as possible when it comes to our work in the area of human rights. So this cooperation needs to be focused on mutual support in the areas such as development, peace and security. And that's what we're working on with the UN. At the recent General Assembly, the statement of Kazakhstan focused on the threats which all countries face, including Kazakhstan, principally post-COVID recovery and the climate crisis and the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. We have seen significant economic and social consequences in Kazakhstan. We have high unemployment, or we have had high unemployment, and I think that poverty is a situation in the world today. More than 300 million children need support, and we want to make sure that we can respond to such situations. We need very much to restructure our budget. So when we look at what can be done in the area of human rights, we find ourselves in a situation where we need to take decisions in the social sphere which relate to a lack of resources. Now, there are dangers linked to lack of resources, that we can't do everything we want, and that can have an impact on human rights, and we need to be aware of that, so that our main priority when talking about personal safety, individuals' lives, when we're talking about making sure that human rights are protected, well, here the words of the President are important. We need to continue moving forward in the area of human rights, recognizing them as a priority. In June this year, the plan on human rights was adopted on the initiative of the President by the government. This has involved 26 events to date, 26 measures, if you like, which are undergoing implementation. We think that this overall approach should be continued. A lot of issues in this area are linked to the recommendations which have been given by the parliamentarians of the European Parliament as well. So it's very important that we are very much aware of how the plan is being implemented. And one way of making sure that that information is available is the briefings that we have with the government on the stages of implementation of the human rights plan. What's particularly important for me personally is that this dialogue which is taking place today with the European Parliament, with individual governments and with civil society should be in a bilateral format. We should be able to listen to one another. The President wants to have a listening state, and in order to be a listening state, we need to recognize the voices involved in any given discussion. It's important to have a mutual flow of information, and I'd like to thank all parties involved in such dialogues. We're making real efforts to raise questions which we believe require a response. For example, the question that was raised by the parliamentarians of the European Parliament, such as cruel and inhuman treatment and torture. This is a very important issue. We need to look at individual cases, and the government has prepared a draft legislation, and we hope that under discussion in Parliament, civil society will actively participate in the discussion. There are three very important parts to this. First is the one of human relations and humane conditions for individuals suffering disabilities, for example. The situations involving their detention. Secondly, is the more effective relationship with alternative measures of detention and punishment, because deprivation of freedom is not always the answer. It gives rise to a whole range of issues, and we understand today that there are still many issues within the penitentiary system. So we welcome the decision taken by the government, which was taken very recently, to build new institutions in the penitentiary system, 16 of them, each holding up to 2,000 individuals. Many institutions date from the Tsarist regimes and are in a terrible situation. So this is welcome news. But the first thing we need to do then is to review how things are moving forward. The public prosecutor.
Да, хорошо.
Yes, I will. The review of our approaches. As I say, we welcome the President's government on implementing 14 indicators developed by the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. We want to apply these indicators. We have proposals supported by the government to involve society in issues such as human trafficking, torture, cruel and inhuman treatment. There are many related issues here. What we hope is that...
Я на этом...
Well, allow me to stop there. All of the other issues, any questions that parliamentarians have, I'll be very happy to answer. Thank you.
Merci. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à Monsieur Евгений Жовтис.
Evgeny Jovtis is the next speaker. He's the director of the International Bureau of Human Rights and the Rule of Law, and a maximum of 7 minutes. If you could actually limit it to just 5 minutes, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Ну, пожалуйста, идите.
Mr. Jovtis, I apologize, but we can't hear you. We are going to refresh your connection. Thank you.
Bon. Alors, peut-être que nous pourrons...
Okay, well then maybe while waiting we can give the floor to Ms. Ritman. Would that be possible? Is she online? Okay, good. Then Ms. Ritman will give you the floor again for a maximum of 7 minutes. And I'd say the same thing to you as well. If you could limit it to 5 minutes, that would be wonderful because we're running slightly behind.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak before you today and want to start by thanking the European Parliament for its attention to the worrying human rights situation in Kazakhstan, in particular to the Kazakh authorities' recurrent attacks on civil society, media professionals, and government critics. The European Parliament's urgency resolution on Kazakhstan, adopted in February this year, rightly identified the persistent patterns of human rights abuses occurring in the country. It was also especially timely. The resolution was passed when the country's most prominent civil society groups faced a wave of harassment and intrusive and unfounded tax-related investigations. Right after the EP announced it would adopt the resolution, Kazakh authorities withdrew the fines and suspensions imposed on over a dozen local groups. We're also grateful to EU institutions in Brussels and the delegation in Nur-Sultan for raising concern about the Kazakh authorities' misuse of criminal disseminating false information charges against activists, for EU officials sending strong messages of concern at the International Labour Organization and urging Kazakhstan to reform its trade union law, and for its ongoing support for civil society groups in the country. When it comes to Kazakhstan, we're used to the country's well-oiled public relations machinery. Their message is often, we're willing to talk issues of human rights. This was also the spirit in which President Tokayev's visit to Brussels took place last month. But talking the talk behind closed doors cannot and must not be an end in and of itself. There is no doubt that the EU as a whole has leverage when it comes to raising human rights issues with Kazakh officials. On this basis, it should expect more than empty promises. It should expect actual and genuine human rights reforms. In an opinion piece published before his Brussels visit, President Tokayev wrote that, and I quote, "Protecting human rights and consolidating civil society is an unquestionable duty." End quote. But as President Tokayev was heading to Brussels, we learned of the tragic death of dissident and poet Arona Atabeka, who passed away just weeks after he was released from prison, after serving about 15 years of an 18-year prison sentence. At the time of his release, he was completely emaciated. He had repeatedly alleged ill treatment and torture during his time in detention, yet his allegations were ignored or dismissed. Such tragic events show how hollow Kazakh government commitments on human rights can be. I will focus my remarks on three key human rights issues in Kazakhstan right now: the abuse of anti-extremism legislation to crack down on government critics, restrictions on independent labor organizing, and the widespread problem of domestic violence. Kazakh authorities have continued their multi-year crackdown on government critics, targeting with criminal prosecution alleged proponents of the democratic choice of Kazakhstan and Koshe, or Street Party, which are groups that have been banned as extremist in recent years. Courts have convicted dozens of people on extremism-related charges, subjecting them to restrictions on their movement and online activity, including by imposing multi-year bans on engaging in political or civic activities. At least half a dozen people have been sentenced to time in prison this year. Let me speak their names: Askar Kayırbek, Erbol Eskojin, Alasbek Akhmetov, Ashat Jeksibayev, Kairat Klyshev, Abay Begimbetov, and Noyan Brahimjanov. When it comes to freedom of association for trade unions, despite the adoption of amendments to the repressive 2014 trade union law last year, which was a very welcome development, authorities nonetheless continue to deny registration to independent unions and to interfere in their legitimate activities. In February, the Independent Industrial Trade Union of Fuel and Energy Workers was suspended for 6 months. And since its liquidation in 2017, the Congress of Free Trade Unions of Kazakhstan has not been able to resume its activities. Yet spontaneous worker action increased this year, showing the need for better workers' rights protections, even as authorities in some cases took legal action against workers for organizing illegal strikes. Turning to domestic violence, President Tokayev himself has repeatedly noted how acute this problem is. Yet in January, Parliament suspended review of a new draft domestic violence law and has not since then proposed any new legislation offering strengthened protection to women from family abuse. Meanwhile, law enforcement and the judiciary regularly fail to adequately respond to women's allegations of abuse or to hold perpetrators accountable, including due to poor legal remedies in place. Just last week, authorities in Almaty denied permission for an International Women's Day march on March 8th next year, 3 months ahead of the event. In light of these and other abuses, we call on EU leaders and its institutions to urge Kazakh officials to move beyond words and actually deliver on promised reforms. This should include revising the definition of extremism and no longer misusing Article 405 of the Criminal Code to target perceived critics, and reviewing the court-imposed bans on DVK and Kosher Party, ensuring that independent trade unions can register and carry out their activities without fear of retaliation or forced closure, and allowing the Independent Industrial Trade Union of Fuel and Energy Workers to resume its activities, and explicitly criminalizing domestic violence and ensuring that women facing abuse have streamlined access to support services, including shelters in rural areas. We hope the EAS will prioritize these and other human rights issues in its bilateral relations with the Kazakh government. We urge the EU to continue to ensure that concerns about Kazakhstan's human rights record are also reflected in its public statements, as it did in its statement following its recent human rights dialogue with Kazakhstan regarding restrictions on peaceful assembly, freedom of expression, trade unions, and abuse of extremism laws against critical voices. Finally, we welcome that the 2019 EU Central Asia strategy reflected stronger language and higher objectives for human rights protection in the region, and that this commitment was reaffirmed at the EU Central Asia ministerial meeting last month. It's time for the EU to call on President Tokayev to put an end to the worst forms of abuses and to demonstrate that the government's pledges for reforms are meaningful and genuine. Thank you very much.
Je vous remercie, Madame Ritman.
Thank you, Ms. Ritman. Mr. Žovtis, have you been able to join us? Can we hear him? Is it working? Can we hear you?
Dear Mr. Žovtis, you should receive a pop-up with the window. If you can please accept the suggestion to change the microphone.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Мы вас слышим. Давайте.
Okay, thank you very much, distinguished members of the parliament. I will try to be brief because of the bad connection. First of all, I want to start with the assurances which were made by our authorities for the last 2 years about some liberalization of the legislation, political reforms, and so on and so on and so on. I want to mention several positive examples of such developments. Of course, for sure. First of all, of course, it's abolition of death penalty. Second, it's the adoption of the law on ombudsperson, which brings this national institution in line with the Paris principles. Of course, this is the adoption of the administrative procedural code, which introduced German model of administrative justice, and some reforms in the sphere of fighting torture, penitentiary system, women's rights, and rights of the children and people with disabilities. This is what I could mention, and it is obvious. But then we have to turn to the serious concerns. in spite again of the fact that there is a law on public oversight now in the parliament, and a lot of different councils, different working groups, different platforms are organized, and we are participating in these platforms. The result of this dialogue, unfortunately, especially when it relates to political rights and civil freedom, is very weak, speaking frankly. It is about the legislation and about the practice. And I could mention several key points. Number one, peaceful assembly. The law which was adopted last year is still fell short of any international standards. Spontaneous assemblies are prohibited. Authorization procedure is still in place for the processions and demonstrations. The notification procedure for pickets and rallies looks like notification, but in reality it's also authorization. And you could conduct the peaceful assembly only in 2-3 places in the cities, and processions and marches only on one route. Preventive detentions are widespread before the people even held the peaceful assembly. And finally, during last couple of months, the authorities are using so-called kettling, trying to circulate the group of protesters and hold them on the cold for several hours. Second, which concerns me, is it was already said by my colleague from Human Rights Watch, is anti-extremist legislation and misuse of this legislation, because there is a very good report done by the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights while countering terrorism. This is misuse of this legislation against peaceful protesters, against expression of views, and it results in the numbers of political prisoners and civic activists which are under the huge pressure. My colleague from Human Rights Watch already mentioned some of them, but I could add two things very important. Besides being sentenced to imprisonment, and besides or to the restriction of freedom or some other punishment, practically all of these so-called extremists are prohibited from public activities, which is practically sort of vague definition, because there is no legal definition what is public activity. People banned from attending courses and seminars or conferences. People banned from the posts and blogs. People banned from the participation in public association. And besides anything else, all these people are included in so-called list of people financing terrorism and extremism, which they do not finance at all. Yeah?
Merci, Monsieur de...
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for being so concise and extremely efficient. Very reassuring on certain points. But I would add, very worrying on many others. Unfortunately, you were more worrying on more points than you were reassuring. I would like now to give our colleagues, members of the committee, the opportunity to speak either here in the room or speaking remotely. I'd like to start once again with Rojha Tun.
Elle est encore avec nous?
Is she still present?
Avec vous. Thank you very much. Mr. Jovtis and Mrs. Ritman said the most important points. I don't want to prolong, and also my plane starts in a few minutes. Thank you very much for those expressions and for those, so to say, I can call them reports. Mrs. Azimova spoke for a longer time, and Mrs. Azimova, we met mid of July. That's many months, and you said exactly the same text. And I gave you a long list of political prisoners. You talk about dialogue, about reforms, about plans to be adopted, about whatever undergoing implementation, etc., etc. But in this time, prisoners rot in prisons. They give false testimonies because they are under torture. You talk about dialogue. With how many NGOs have you met? Could you list them maybe? Which NGOs were they? Because we only hear that there is no dialogue with you. And you talk about the listening state. Whom do you listen to? I hope that you listened to the two previous speakers. Their picture is dramatic, and according to all my knowledge, this picture is completely right, even if it's not a little bit more optimistic than what I hear. So I would like to know concrete, not constant talks about this dialogue, improvement plans, etc., etc. But what has changed completely? Can you give us names of people who were released? I participate online in political trials. It really doesn't look like any improvement, and we hear the same words. We have been hearing the same words for many, many years already. Please be concrete and show us those improvements on concrete cases. Thank you very much.
Merci, Rúža.
Thank you, Rúža. Do we have any more questions? I'm sorry to say this, but I'd like to discourage you from asking questions because we really are late. But if members do insist on taking the floor, go ahead. My apologies, I hadn't seen you.
Gracias, Bernard.
Thank you very much. I'm ashamed we don't have much time. I have a lot to say. I also had the chance to meet the ombudsman back in July, and I agree with what Rosa said. We're talking about the inner circle. That's to say, those who are a bit further away from the neighborhood group. We've just discovered today, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, there's a growing interest in this area. And the fact is that because of the situation in Afghanistan, there's more focus on this area. What we're talking about is a corridor. And we're talking about questions of security, stability, and agendas of this type always seem to come before human rights. That's a standard fact of life, an axiom, if you like. We talked about silent diplomacy, which seems to have been conducted here. So this idea of silent diplomacy when we're talking about human rights in a country which seems to be falling into the grip of an authoritarian system, is that a general position of the European Foreign Affairs agency? Is this would also apply to China, other countries? The chairman interrupts. Unfortunately, our colleagues from the External Action Service aren't with us anymore. Thank you, Bernard.
Pardon, Monsieur.
My apologies.
Two very short questions, Mr. Chairman, to our last two speakers. First of all, on religious freedom, could you inform me and the colleagues about the situation of religious freedom in Kazakhstan, and in particular, the very messages I received on converts from Islam to Christianity, that they themselves and their families are under severe pressure. That's my first issue. My second question is also on the Uyghur minorities in Kazakhstan. We know Kazakhstan is approaching China. What's the effect of that on the Uyghur minorities in Kazakhstan? Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Miss Hautala, are you still present, and would you like to ask another question or not? Apparently, no. In that case, would anybody else like to ask a question? Once again, I really would prefer it if you could avoid asking a question, given the fact that we are so much behind time. Good, my wish came true. Miss Azimova, you have 2 minutes to answer the question.
Благодарю за вопросы, госпожа.
Thank you, Ms. Rojha Tun. There were points I didn't touch upon, but obviously I have the right to structure my stretch as I wish. The process, as we've heard from Ms. Ritman, involves many facets. As we've just heard, there's been a visit of the President. So what's important there is the measures that have been taken, not the question of whether or not the list took place, the visit took place. Ms. Tun talks about a list handed over during a meeting. 6 of the names have been released. 11 have had their freedom restricted, but there was also a question about additional measures, and I think that it's necessary to have a clear understanding of the penalties applied. We are working on this at the moment. We have long legal processes underway, and we need to work with the courts and the public prosecutor. 100% of these issues can't be solved. We are moving forward. We have work to do. With regard to religious freedom in Kazakhstan, I've listened to your concerns. Today, the problems that have been raised are being considered by the Parliament, and there are amendments being considered in the light of reports from religious experts. There are also freedom of worship issues, etc. So we are working in this area as well. And with regard to the ethnic Kazakhs who live on the territory and are raising issues about their relatives being released, those in the territory of China, and obviously we take into account that this is another state. It's rather difficult at the moment to talk about any predictable results. However, there have been meetings. I've met with them, and I'm continuing this dialogue with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Public Prosecutor, but it's a complex issue.
Thank you, Madam. I'm really very sorry. I have to cut you off. We really do have no time left. I'm sorry to tell you that. Thank you very much for your very useful testimony and your answers to our questions. Although it would appear some members felt they didn't cover all the ground requested. Mr. Žovtis, I can give you 1 minute maximum if you really want to speak, but I can't give you any more, I'm sorry.
Oui.
Yes.
Вы здесь? Ну, хорошо. Ну, давайте.
Mr. Žovtis, we don't hear you again.
Il m'entend pas?
Can you please speak a little bit now?
Bon. Si c'est ça, je crains que nous devions renoncer à...
I'm afraid we won't be able to listen to you, sir. I'm very sorry, we can't connect.
Вы меня... Нет. Ну? Alors?
Can you please speak now?
Вы с нами или нет?
Can you hear us? Are you with us? No.
We hear us. Can you please
Жал. Жал, ну извините.
It's a shame. Apologies.
He doesn't hear me neither, I think. Okay.